Hello, everybody. We are live. It is the July 11th session of the Golden Path to Spring One. It is the second to the last session in this amazing series that has been basically twice a week for about 6 months. And we're leading into next month's Spring One at Explore in Las Vegas. So really happy to have you here for this session. Mark, how are you doing?
Good. Nice to see
Good.
you.
Where are you joining us from today?
New York City.
Nice. Looks like you're in an office, some official environment there.
Yeah, it's the VMware office here in Chelsea.
Cool. Well, we're thrilled to have you, and I guess I'll. Why don't I give you an opportunity? I'm for those of you who don't know, haven't been part of the series. I'm one of the hosts for the series. Cora Iverglide. I'm a developer advocate at VMware, and yeah, Mark, do you want to say some words about your background, your role at VMware?
Yeah, my title is a senior software engineer. I've been involved in Spring projects for over a long time, going over a decade. I helped start the Spring Data project, and then the Spring XD and Spring Cloud Data Flow, and then recently have moved into the project I'll be talking about today called Spring CLI. So definitely focused on the Spring open source ecosystem of projects.
Very cool. Great. So I will turn the screen over to you. I'm going to share your slides, and then I'll pop off the screen. I know you can keep an eye on the chat. I'll also keep an eye on the chat, and we'll make sure that people's questions get answered. So with that, Mark, here are your slides, and the hour is yours.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the Spring CLI. I would just like to categorize it basically as focusing on helping developers be more productive. And this generally means talking about code and deployment. And we'll get into how that is achieved during this webinar. There we go. So part of the motivation for creating this new project, which is now living in the experimental repo, so it's in the middle of incubation, is the surveys that we take every year to find out from our community what we're doing well, what we're doing poorly, where we can, have improvements. And a consistent theme is around documentation and getting started. Part of these efforts were begun last year. So if you've looked at the new Spring security and Spring Boot documentation, they're made using Antora. That's part of the initiative, and Spring CLI is also part of this initiative. The CLI focuses on a few main use cases: creating new applications, adding code and configuration to existing applications, which is really where I think the majority of time spent using this tool will be, and then deploying applications. And the way applications get deployed is really the general mechanism by which you can invoke other CLIs to help you achieve the goal. So what we'll see later is deploying to Azure Spring Apps. That involves using the AZ command line tool. So I like to think a bit of the functionality we have here akin to GitHub Actions, but focused on client-side use cases. So let's get into it. So how do you create new applications in Spring? I'm sure everyone has some sort of recipe in their head. Probably no two are completely the same. But I have a feeling that your answer is going to end up involving Google and a bunch of cut and paste. And this is really a substandard approach, something that I want to change with the Spring CLI. So the first command in the Spring CLI to get to know is a command called boot new. So Spring is the name of the application I run, the CLI application, command line interface. And boot and new, kind of self-describing. Give me a new boot app. And by default, this is going to create a simple web application. We'll do the demo, and we'll get to know this command better. Roughly what it does to kind of set the expectations is it creates a new project by looking at an existing working project that does contain code in a GitHub repo. So you can have a CI system making sure that that code is up to date and working well and passing tests. And what we do is a small modification of that existing working project. So you can specify things like the package name, the group ID, and the project name, of course. So for those who are familiar with the JavaScript ecosystem, you can think of this as, the Create React app, right? It's a very popular way to bootstrap creating React apps. So this is sort of a cousin to that type of experience. I mentioned you can create a simple web application by default, but there are many other application types that you could use to start out, and those are chosen from a project catalog. The project catalogs are not tied down. Anyone can contribute a project catalog to the Spring CLI, and then you can create your own new projects using that. I'm sure everyone on this call is familiar with Initializer, the application that runs on start.spring.io, called Initializer. And there is actually a Spring Initializer command, which is sort of, I guess, a way to access what is clearly a very, very popular way to get a new application running, but that application doesn't have any code in it. So it's really only giving you the correct dependencies and build system. Whereas Spring Boot New focuses on giving you working code. So where can you get this? I put these URLs up in case people want to browse the documentation or browse the source code or build it themselves. I'll leave it up here just for a moment. So the main thing is to go to the organization Spring Projects Experimental on GitHub. And there you see a few things, one of which is Spring CLI. So let me get into doing a demo. Make this a little bigger. So now we have to give it a name. Let's call it a REST app. And I like to use a different package name than the default. So it's a small kxkcb.demo. We'll look into the other options for this command, but it's good to just see it here. So it's getting this project from a certain location. That's where I have my REST service. I'm refactoring because the package name that's living in this repo is not com.xkcb.demo. It's something else. And now the project's ready to go in this directory REST app. So if you look here, make this a little bigger, you'll see a standard layout. I'll load this into IntelliJ. Put this over here. So you have a README. Sorry, that briefly explains what this app is doing. Actually, it should be in Markdown. But anyway, basic POM and some source code. So here we see the main Spring Boot application class. And here you see small domain object called greeting, one called greeting controller. And if people are familiar with our getting started guide for REST, this is a variation or a derivative of that getting started guide. So it's very, very simple. And it includes a test to get you started. I can run the test while we're here. I'll build it on the command line in any case. So that should be happy. There it is, green check. Oops, I'll just build it here locally and run it. All right, so it started up. I think it's greeting. So there you go. I have the world's most simple app up and running. So what I'll do now is I'll stop this and I'll initialize the repository, because as we add things, oops, we'll look at Git to do see changes. We'll go back now to the slideshow. Oh, actually, let me first go here. You can also enter interactive mode. It supports both calling through the command line and the so-called interactive mode. It's a little easier to show things sometimes in one way. You do help. It gives you an idea of what commands are around. And we're only going to go through a few of them. The ones we did right now were, oops, on the top here, boot new, boot add. So if I do boot new, you see it was red. Now it's white, indicating it is a command. That's thanks to new features in the Spring shell. If I ask for help, you see what you can get help with. So you could specify the group ID, artifact ID, version, description. These are all standard things that you'd see in your POM to define your artifact coordinates. And then the beginning, name, that's what I called REST app. And by default, from is the repo that gets the web app, but it could be something else. And as we talk about project catalogs later, it refers to basically a name of a known project that's registered with the CLI, or just an arbitrary URL of a project living on GitHub. So those are some of the, I'll exit that and go back here. So yeah, talking about project catalogs. These are curated samples. The ones I've developed so far have mostly been from our Getting Started guides, but there are others that have no counterpart, for example, in our Getting Started guides, such as GraphQL or Spring Cloud Stream applications. And that's kind of what's contained more or less in the default catalog. It's open and extensible, so you can add your own catalogs by URL. We'll show an example of that in a moment. And what's important here is, there's often been complaints in the Spring ecosystem about initializer, and how do you get your checkbox there for your project that uses your library. Maybe something internal to your company, or maybe you're another open source project maintainer and would like it listed there. This is going to give you that experience to reach more of the Spring audience by having your own catalogs that we can register with the CLI to make them available, but they don't have to be centrally registered. You can just share around catalog URLs. Hope that was clear. I'll now jump into showing. Oops. I wanted to go here. So before I created the web app, but project list shows you all the different types of projects you can create. So by default, earlier we created the web app, but you can create a JPA app or scheduling, add the config client. Here are some for Spring Cloud Stream. So what I'll do is I'll create a new one. For example, boot new my JPA app. Or just be my JPA. So I'll specify the name, and that's just a shorthand, to this repo that actually has the working code. So maybe it's worthwhile opening that up. And you can see this is just a regular project. Has com.example as the name, but we're going to give it a different name for the package. So there it's refactoring. So, and if I go to my JPA, you see there's a customer repository and a test and so on. But we'll go back to the REST app for the rest of the demo. And the project catalog, you can list which ones are available. This is what I was talking about, where you could have a predefined list. Right now we only have one. Sort of a first collaborator was someone from the Dapper community. Cora was helping in that effort. And so this is a catalog of applications that use Dapper, which is a runtime on Kubernetes that has support for Spring Boot. So if I do Spring project catalog, add Dapper, oops. And now do Spring project list, oops. You'll see there are new projects here. There's read one, which is the app for reading from a state store. So now this is available for you to use and create apps. I won't go through creating one of these. You saw me do it with JPA, but that's the idea. You can kind of add these catalogs that bring on off-the-shelf functionality and projects for a particular sort of domain or project or however it is that you want to group these things together that seems appropriate to you in the catalog. Come back to the slides here. So that's the catalogs. And now this is really where I expect the CLI tool to be used extensively. You create a project once, but you add features to existing applications all the time. And the same statement as creating a new application is think for yourself, how do you go about doing this? I'm sure it involves Google and cut and paste and taking things from different spots that seem appropriate. And the idea is to have more structure and a better way to do that by using a command called Spring Boot add. And that's what we'll demonstrate next. So what does Spring Boot add do? Again, the same projects that were used to create the application the first time now can be added to your existing project. And it does this by performing an intelligent merge of the two code bases. So for example, if we're using Maven, there's a lot of information in the POM XML file, such as dependencies, properties, plugins. So we merge the one that has the new code into your current project. Refactors, of course, to use the project name of your current project. And it's kind of a long tail of what needs to be merged. Sometimes in a Spring Boot application, on the main Spring Boot application class, you have to add an annotation like enable scheduling, or I don't know, there's a whole bunch of them. So that stuff gets merged, and application.properties or application.yaml, those also get merged. In addition, convention that we like to have is to have a README file in every repository, and that is meant to be a communication to people using this as to how the functionality you added works. So if you're adding JPA, there is which we'll do in a moment, you'll see that there'll be a little README explaining how the JPA functionality works. And I should mention now, maybe should have mentioned earlier, a lot of this sophisticated manipulation of the project is using the Open Rewrite project to perform these merges and actions. I'll jump into using the command Spring Boot add. So here we are. With this functionality. So I do Spring Boot add JPA. I'm now going to add JPA functionality. Again, just using H2, of course, but there are others for MySQL and whatnot.
Well,
and you can see.
Sorry, yeah. Mark, just while you're waiting for that to execute.
Sure.
Simon Verhoeven, which I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Simon. Now, he says, brave question, are there any plans for Basel besides Maven and Gradle?
Yeah, which build system is Basel for? I don't even remember. I'm basically focused on Maven right now. And of course, people bring up Gradle. I'm not sure what's involved in merging a Basel build file, but anything's on the table. So I'm happy to take suggestions.
Cool. Or pull requests, I guess.
Or pull requests, yeah, why not?
All right, I'll let you get to it.
Yeah, sure, that was a good question. So this dependency, this is what got merged into the POM. We'll take a look at that, and then the refactoring. So if I go back to the IDE, you can see now there's a README called README JPA. So remember, we type Spring Boot add JPA, so the file name has the suffix there, JPA, to indicate that's where it came from. And there's not a lot here. You could probably have more, depending on the intent of what you wanted to convey, more as a tutorial or more as a reminder. That's up to you when you make your own projects. This probably could be a little more detailed. And didn't add a ton of stuff, but you can get the idea. It added the customer repository, and what's nice is you get a test. I find myself a lot of times I forget how to test, and having this as a reminder ready to go helps streamline my workflow. So I'll run this. And so the test passes. So here, if you look at the differences, it's inserted starter JPA and H2 database. And all the files it added were what we were just walking through before. So if I'll package and run it again. So I see a beautiful question. So I'll take it myself. How is this different? This is Siraz. How is this different with something like JHipster that can also bootstrap a complete Spring Boot application? So the key difference is that JHipster relies on having your project templated using some JavaScript tooling. So you have to create a fully working app using curly braces, whereas what this is doing is it's taking complete working projects. There's no curly braces in them. You could just most often just point to someone's existing repo, and that sort of becomes the project template, if you will. But there's no templating going on in the sense of a template engine. So that's kind of the key difference. And I think that there is a role for templating, and we'll see very shortly. In fact, the next set of demos is around using templating for code generation. But what I found with using tools like JHipster is that as a producer of a project that will be generated by JHipster, there's a lot of cycling through, and you're using tool sets for manipulating the POM around templating. I find it's very clunky. So you have to edit the template, run the template, make sure it works, and when you're finally done, publish that artifact somewhere. This approach, especially I think in the getting started case where you might have a lot of code, maybe a lot of setup in your POM with plugins, is a much more easier onboarding experience to achieve fairly similar goals. I can't say I know every nook and cranny of JHipster's functionality, but that's the basic difference. Hope that answered the question. Happy to explain more on that front. Okay, so where was I? Yeah, so we got the, and here you see that it was whatever it was doing, loading stuff for JPA. Go back to the presentation. So user-defined commands, this is a little bit more JHipster-like, if you will, but I think you'll see there's a bit of a different twist. So user-defined commands are declaratively defined, so it's easy for you to bring them. They're just a bunch of files. And what they do is they integrate tightly into the CLI itself. So again, there are some actions that you take over and over again, similar to the JavaScript ecosystem, where you might need a component or you have a template for like a feature, package by feature. What is in that feature? It's usually a controller, a service layer, a repository, a bunch of tests for each. So if you want to add to your existing code base some component, right? Spring is a component model, then you can create user-defined commands that help you add a component. And we'll see an example of that. But you can also use it to generate config files. Let's say you want to generate a bunch of Kubernetes config files or anything else, really. And we'll see that in a moment. So what I'll show now is a user-defined command, or show how user-defined commands generally are created and work. And then we'll use it to create a new controller. And this is based off a handlebars template. And these commands live side by side with your code, which is another important distinction with approaches like JHipster. If you don't like the code that's being generated, you can just very easily go to your own repo and change it. And you don't need to go through a whole sort of separate build lifecycle in another area. So there's a large range of tasks that you can do in these user-defined commands. It's evolved over time. I think you can have a mental model, which is, it's like GitHub Actions, but for client-side project use cases. You can add dependencies to your code as well in the POM. There are actions for that. You can add code and tests, and you can also execute other CLIs. And what's important is that what you have available in these template variables is all sorts of project information, such as artifact ID or the artifact location. Whatever you can envision in a POM project model is at your fingertips. So I'll go to a demo of the user-defined command. So, So what I'll do is I'll create a new command. Oh, let me just do this, git status. All right. So I'll introduce this by creating a command that generates a single file to kind of set the tone before we show you how to create new Java code. So here we are. So this new command, and it's living under a directory called .spring commands. The command here is hello, and the subcommand name is new. So if I go to the project and look at command, this describes the command. So we have an argument name called greeting. And the actual command itself is a list of actions. One is to generate a file. We're going to generate hello.txt file. And in that file, we're going to say hello and whatever the greeting is. So I'll pass in a greeting. So you have access to the command line options inside the templating expression. And here's an example of some predefined variables. The OS name, this comes from system properties. It's just a dash instead of a dot. Everything in the system tries to keep itself to kebab case. So now if I do Spring help, say what commands are available, see that there's hello new, right? Or do Spring hello new help. I can pass in a greeting. So I do Spring hello new greeting. Instead of saying world, we'll say it in another language. And there you go, hello on Linux, right? And so you can add to this if you wanted very easily, like we'll do java-version, that's another one. So now I'll remove this because that will be generated again. So you can see how easy it is to transition between changing what you have as it evolves. And then, suppose this was more serious and creating hello.txt, you can check this back into your repo, and now the rest of your team has that immediately available to use. And so it really encourages collaboration to improve whatever code or config generation techniques, commands you've developed. So if you look at hello.txt, see it's Java 17. So with that said, I will get maybe I can look at the questions first. Thank you for using Antora. Of course, Antora rocks. So there isn't a catalog functionality yet for user-defined commands. That's coming, but you can just import them from anywhere you like. So in this case, I'm getting it from here. And you can see it's .spring.commands controller new, and there's 3 files in there. Now those 3 files live over here. So this is the same thing. Basically, I'm sort of doing a very poor man's version of adding a feature in the sort of theme of package by feature. So this just describes the CLI argument feature. By default, it's person. And here's another generate command. And you can see now it gets a little more sophisticated. So there are predefined variables that are the root package directory. Here's the variable, which is the command line option feature. And there are helpers in templating languages. So one of them is capitalized first. So it's expected you to pass the feature in without a capital. And we're going to take the template text from this file. And again, here, this can start to look gnarly when it gets really big. Like if you have 50 files, right? Eyes start to glaze over a bit when you look at Java code that has a lot of curly braces in it. Less so for configuration, in my opinion. But there you go. It's going to create this package under the feature name, create the controller with that uppercase feature prefix. And let's do that, see what happens. So I think right now in the commit, let me do that now. Okay. Whatever. So I will run that now. So again, if you do Spring help, see hello new, controller new appears here. Spring controller new help. So that's what it is, and we'll do feature order. It doesn't matter. So it generated the order controller. See, that's an unversioned file. There it is. Here's order controller. Again, this is not a real order controller. It's just meant to take up the level of sophistication of what you can generate, one level higher. So you can use this as a basis to create other things as well. So you kind of have these two options, I'd say. You can merge in existing code, kind of existing feature sets from an already working code base, or you can generate it more in like JHipster style fashion with this templating model. Okay, let me get back to the slides. There's that here, I guess. Yeah, so now we'll discuss how you can use this to deploy applications. So these are user-defined commands that create config files and invoke platform-specific command lines to deploy your application. So it's not necessarily maybe the golden path to what your company has done, but it starts to, I think there was like some George Carlin joke of how do you create a path? It's like first you have to walk and you have to push the grass down yourself, right? So if you're just learning to get started with, say, Azure Spring Apps, you probably don't want a whole bunch of Bicep or Terraform templates thrown at you. You kind of want to learn how to use it incrementally through the CLI. And this definitely gets you on that path, although nothing prevents you from creating user-defined commands that create Bicep or Terraform files so that when you're ready to go for that next level of sophistication, that can be available to you. So we really don't dictate a lot of the tooling. You can adapt Spring CLI to have very simple high-level commands that wrap whatever tooling your company has picked as the way to deploy your apps. So the one we'll look at now is Azure Spring Apps. It's a service hosted by Microsoft on Azure, geared toward deploying and running your Spring applications. So, like I mentioned, this deploys your app in one command to Azure. And we're developing this very closely with Microsoft. They've identified a lot of gaps, I guess you'd say, in the user experience of deploying apps only using the AZ CLI. It's often because it's just a few too many steps. So it's nice to reduce the number of steps. Or it's kind of passing in a lot of repeated information over and over again, like in a shell script. So this provides, I think, a lot more flexibility and consistency in the approach. So going forward, we can expect the Azure Spring Apps to be using Spring CLI when it's released to help in this deployment experience. So if I go back to here, oops, no, Git. That's funny. So now what I'll do is I'll get another user-defined function, or command, sorry. If I look at what's been added, I have 3 new functions. I have, commands. I have ASA deploy, which we spoke about, provision, which I won't do, but it's good to show because it takes too long, so I don't want to waste people's time. I've already pre-provisioned. And so what it's doing is it's using the command az group to get whatever the first resource group is and use that as the resource group. Resource group, for those not familiar with the terminology in Spring Azure, is kind of like your namespace, right, of where your apps run. One improvement we're wrapping up is to present the user with a list of resource groups. So if you have 5 of them, which maybe is common or is typically common if you're using Azure Spring Apps, then you can set that variable, ask it once in a Q&A format, and set that variable. And then this is really where things go in terms of executing other CLIs. So basic recipe you have to do to provision the most minimal infrastructure in Azure Spring Apps is to call it AZ Spring Create and AZ Spring App Create. And so here we're reusing resource group, which again came dynamically from querying. And your name of a resource group needs to be unique, which is often a sticking point in a lot of the documentation for Azure Spring Apps. Here we just call it the use the username, so hopefully there are less conflicts. We can improve this probably to be more random, but for now this is okay. And similar, here we're saying create an app, and here you can start to see a little bit of how having access to variables that come from your Maven POM file, namely your project name, can be useful to pass into the command line. So this is templated, and you get to replace it. So if I look at deploy, again, there's really getting this thing. And now passing in this long line. And another good example, we know that this is Java version 17, and you need to indicate that to Azure Spring Apps by passing in this -- runtime version. And then we print out where it is, and hopefully that works. So just build it, make sure that it has the latest artifact. Okay. So this might take a little while. So you can see what command it's doing.
I guess while we wait for that, a question from Edu from Test Containers project. He was actually working with so the example that you showed with Dapper was just to, I guess, to fill in the gaps, right? You and me kind of testing out Mauricio Salatino's work to see to explore like the fit with the Spring CLI, and we know that Edu and Mauricio were working on making Dapper work more easily with test containers, or test container supporting Dapper, of the components that it needs to stand up. So here's next step further, Edu, throwing a challenge out. What do you think?
Yeah, so the dev mode, I think there's a lot of interesting things around the dev mode, and not just its tight integration now with adding test containers. But for sure, the idea is that we haven't gotten this sophisticated yet in explaining the feature set of Spring CLI, but the actions you take, for example, adding a dependency into your POM, or creating a file can be dependent on what your dependencies are, right? And this is kind of automatically handled with the test container infrastructure. But let's say you didn't want to use the test container infrastructure. You actually wanted to provision, MySQL on Azure instead, like really provision it. You could create the config files to do that, right? So wherever there's something streamlined, like in collaboration, the test container team and the Spring Boot team made this first-class support, and that's great. And so it's not really intended to replace that. Probably could be augmented, but there are a lot of cases where a lot of stuff you'd like to generate are based on your dependencies, right? So if you have a dependency on, I don't know, let's see, Kafka, right? Like what else would you like to do with that? Maybe it's not test containers. Maybe your company uses raw Docker files, God forbid. I don't know, right? That's okay. I'm not judging you. No problem. Use your files. You can just say Spring Docker init, and the action files will say, oh, I see you have a dependency. I'm going to create this Docker file for you. So there's a lot of, it's kind of open-ended. It could lead to potentially a little chaos. But I think more often than not, it really just streamlines existing patterns you have in the company and hopefully actually creates more order than you currently have.
Cool.
All right. So there is happy to work with anyone. Just email me at mpollock@vmware.com, and I will reply. So it's not up yet. That's weird. Oh, maybe it's greeting. There it is. Hello, world. So that's where it went. And then, yeah, there's a destroy command. So you don't have to, if you remember, you can serve on billing. So you do that, and it tears it all down. And that could be as, fine grain. Oh, what did I call it? Delete app. Anyway, don't even need to do that. Let's go back to, should turn off notifications on Slack. There you go. Do that quickly so I don't. The hell is that? Here we go. Pause notifications. Okay. All right, so I'll go back to the slide deck. Yeah, so this is a cute feature that I explored after ChatGPT stormed the castle, and looked into how well it could use ChatGPT or other large language models, generative large language models, to create code. And I learned a lot, and I think the answer is fairly usable. Not perfect, but I think we can get it to be pretty perfect over time for creating code that really meets your specific use case and not necessarily the ones that we've pre-thought out ahead of time, like we've done with the Getting Started guides. So you can use this command Spring AI add. So it adds code based on what you describe, and we'll show you an example of this in a moment. A lot of the magic here is around a term that's, I guess, becoming common in AI, generative AI circles, called prompt engineering. It's all about what you ask, and asking nicely, and asking in a way that it understands. So that's a little bit of a dark art, but it's learnable. And definitely the prompt I put into Spring CLI went through a lot of changes until ended up with the correct one. So that prompt you don't write. That's kind of the magic sauce to make your simple description work. And often you have to iterate on the description, and we provide a few ways to help you iterate. One of them is to pass in an option called preview, so you don't modify your code base until you see a README of it, of what's going to be changed. And there's a bunch of other small, I would say, built-in code changes we have. Part of the reason for that is ChatGPT itself has information that's going on now 2 years old. So it doesn't know about the the change of the JEE namespace to Jakarta if you want to create an app with the Java 17 base. So, or the latest JEE base libraries. So there's a little bit of extra code manipulation there on the side, but generating code based on the latest and greatest stuff is an area that can be improved, and it's something we're looking into. So because it takes a couple minutes staring at a screen, here's what I just did earlier this morning. And the description, so imagine I did the command, I'll go back here, Spring AI add, and then, where is it? JPA functionality with an integration test, including the same package, use object mapper, oops. All right, to serialize a Java object, blah, blah, blah. That's it, dash, dash preview. It says, generating the code, look at this file for a description. So instead of running that, because it takes too long, I will just take the output of that, and we'll look at that now in the IDE. So here it is. So what you can see is this looks like a README file that you might have had when you went to a Getting Started guide. All right, so it says when it was generated, that was today, earlier this morning, generated using this description, and now off to the races, right? Ooh, I didn't know it did the Maven archetype. Interesting. So it says, here's your dependencies. Here's your main app. We already got that. Here's a person object. Here's a person repository, a person service, controller, and an integration test, and some properties. And then I asked it to create top 5 links it knows about for Spring Data JPA. So it infers, a lot from what you're creating. It knows the main project here is Spring JPA. If you asked it something with Spring Security, it knows that it's dealing with Spring Security. That's all part of the prompt engineering work. And so now what you can do is, I don't even know what I added here. Target. That's weird. Should have been ignored. So there's another command, Spring readme. Oops, here, let's do it this way. Oops. Oh, also, if you're in interactive mode, you can do this. So I can do readme, apply, readme -jpa.md. That was fast, almost too fast. It didn't work. I don't know what's going on there. Something went wrong. Yeah. I guess I screwed it up. Dash file, yeah. Oh, not really. There's another one here. AI, sorry, AI JPA. There we go. I picked the wrong one because I'm adding it twice. JPA functionality. Okay, let's see what it did. So it added what was in there for application properties, and it added a bunch of stuff into So basically, it took what was in that file and it intelligently parsed out the README information, and it knew, what to do. So if we go to the test, I guess, run this. Oops. Hopefully it's happy down here. Yep, it saved the person. So you can see there's like kind of like, I don't know, I guess 3 broad options of how you can add code. You can add code by merging an existing repository of your own choosing, right? Maybe you're using Lombok, maybe you're using a special DTO library, and you've got your feature per package recipe, defined, and it's kind of unique to you. So you can then use the Spring Boot add command for that. If you choose to use templating approach instead of using merge approach of an existing repo, you use user-defined commands, like I showed earlier, creating this order controller. And the last one is like, gets pretty sophisticated. You ask AI to create you an app, and I've gotten pretty far, creating things like create me a Spring Batch application that reads from a file, processes, the lines in the CSV file, and then loads it to a database. And it spat out fairly usable stuff, modulo this limitation that ChatGPT is trained on data that's getting on to be 2 years old. So some things like the method signature of certain things have changed in the latest versions of Spring Boot. So that's an area where you have to put more effort in, but still it's a hell of a good starting point. I don't have that example to show off the top of my head. I think maybe in the docs I have a list of some interesting prompts. But get an API token from OpenAI, and you can experiment yourself. And there's also a rewrite option for AI. Oops. Oops, Spring AI, I'll add. So this rewrite option sometimes is important. I don't think any of us as software developers will say we would pass a major in the language arts. I'm not an English major. I write pretty poorly, I think. And it's all about the prompts, basically, with generative AI. So you can ask it to rewrite what you wrote in order to better perform the task at hand. And sometimes that really makes a difference. In this case, right now, it didn't matter so much, but I found it does make a difference, and so I've added this. And one feature I haven't added, I know we're getting close to the end here, is you can ask it to write it in a style. You could ask it to write it like it's Robert De Niro, and then it says, "Hey buddy, we're going to add dependencies to your POM. Let's get started." It gives that kind of like snarky tone, I guess, that Robert De Niro is famous for. Just to add a little humor into your day. All righty, that's it. Wrapping up, 5 minutes. Okay, a little longer. So there are several features in flight. The catalog for user-defined commands. Lots of work around variables that helps with what I was showing earlier, where you need to sometimes set a few specific variables for use when deploying, for example. Declarative forms, so kind of ripping off the idea of GitHub forms, which you've maybe seen for creating templates for PR submissions or issue submissions on GitHub. This will let the user answer questions, so it can choose from a list, for example, in the case of Spring Azure Apps, a list of resource groups, but it could be any set of choices you defined. Conditional execution through the use of spell. Again, if you're familiar with GitHub Actions, it has an if command, expression, stuff like that. We haven't gotten to release an installer yet. We haven't gotten to releasing a native binary. Those on our roadmap. And the last major feature, which will come maybe not in the first version, but subsequently, is working with the Spring Boot Migrator team, who've been experimenting with how to upgrade from, let's say, version 2 of Boot to version 3 using open rewrite recipes, or going from Java EE stack to a Spring stack, or moving off of MuleSoft onto a Spring stack, whatever the migration story is. But there are several possibilities, but upgrading your version of Spring Boot from 2 to 3, that's something we plan on investing in quite heavily. So in terms of the status, you can go to GitHub and check it out. There's some fairly extensive documentation for what's there now. You could always use improvements, and I love feedback. But going to really time box this release by around Spring 1 in August, so that we can showcase using Spring Azure Apps with the Spring CLI. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Jana. He's the Spring Shell lead now, and he's added a ton of features. One of which I'll show very briefly here around the Q&A. So I do initializer, new. So you see all this colorization, and it's red. Now it's yellow, white, so it's good. But now you can see it's asking, where do you want to create this app? Okay, well, I'm not going to go through with it, but you want to use Maven. Okay, we'll use Kotlin because we're crazy, and so on, right? And then you can answer all these questions, and then when you get to something long like this, right, you can check off multiple. So, and then you can search dog, you see, it filters that list. So a lot of cool functionality there that comes from Spring Shell. And that is it. I will leave this slide up so people can go take a look, and I'll take any more questions you have in the remaining time. Thanks for your attention for this hour.
Amazing, Mark. That's super exciting. It's such cool work. I know that you've been very passionate about trying to make all the guides and documentation easier for people to use, easier to, I guess, use, right? To incorporate into your code and your learning. So it's really great to see where this is.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Very cool.
There's one last question there. Applying open rewrite to the OpenAI code might be a stopgap measure. Yes, I could run the recipe, right, of changing the Jakarta namespace, right? So yeah, I did it by pure regex, and that's kind of what you discover when interacting with these AI models. You never get anything done in one shot. You usually have to iterate, calling it multiple times to achieve your goal and break down the problem. So it becomes a chain of commands, and there's a popular project in the Python community called LangChain that captures the essence of that interaction model. So creating the code and making that README already, I had to separate it out so it made that README in such a way that I could parse it and then apply the information there. So that's like one step. The translation to make it speak like Robert De Niro, that's a second fun step. Third step is like, yeah, clean up any mess with open rewrite. It kind of goes on, and there's a lot to think about there. So yeah,
Cool.
Good question. Thank you.
So if anybody has any other questions that pop up, and we'll take them for sure. But I guess while we're giving a minute for people to do that, I should. Where is this stuff? Okay, so let me do a little bit of promoting here. So please check out Spring Academy. It's free, and you can learn a lot about Spring, no matter where you are in your journey. So that's cool. And then also, please join us at VMware Explore. You'll see an update on what Mark's been showing today, of course, and a lot of other great content, and it'll just be fun, and you'll see us there. So I think, let's see, one more comment here.
I don't know, we can have a bake-off.
That's true.
Yeah, instead of having a cage match with Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, we can have a cage match with AI and Josh.
Right.
In this corner, 46 laptop.
Yeah.
In this corner, Josh.
For anybody on Audio Edu says, I just wonder if the code can be generated faster than Josh does it.
Oh yeah, sorry if people weren't looking. So good job.
I also want to just mention briefly that this, as I mentioned, is the second to the last session. So the next session will be Craig Walls talking about including sort of voice-activated Alexa skills into Spring Boot applications, or coding them with Spring Boot applications. So that should be a lot of fun. Please join us for that. And this is the last one I am personally hosting. So I want to thank everybody for this opportunity, for getting to join you, for getting to host these speakers. It's been a pleasure. And also, like, over the sessions, I've noticed a lot of people coming back, familiar names showing up in the sessions, people helping us answer questions. So I just want to give a sincere thank you to all of our audience and those folks. Thank you, Simon. And Simon continues here. He says, given my usual experience with conference Wi-Fi, my money's on Josh.
Might not be bad to bet on the humans overall.
Yeah. All right. I think that's
all right. Well, thank you, Cora, for all your effort today, and of course for the whole series.
It's been a pleasure. A pleasure. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to put our closing bumper on, and that's it, everybody. Bye-bye.
Have a good rest of the day.